Robert George, who's the professor of moral philosophy over at Princeton, he says he uses this as a sort of thought experiment. He says, okay, so he'll ask his class, you're living in 1860 in Alabama. Are you an abolitionist or are you pro-slavery? And everybody in the room, everyone says I'm an abolitionist. And then he's like, really? Really are you? Because I'd love for you to name these extremely unpopular position you're taking at the risk to your life, reputation, and career right now today. Like that actually risks anything. Because none of you can name any of them, right? You're actually going along to get along with most of your morality. The example that I like to use on this is we're living in an era where everybody thinks of themselves as deeply enlightened and all of this. 100 years from now, all the statues of President Obama will come down. Why? Because he ate meat. 100 years from now, all the statues of President Obama will come down because there's video of him at campaign rallies, in Iowa, at campaign stops, eating a corn dog.
Let's pause there for a second because we're dealing with this cancel culture nonsense right now. Do you think that there is just a certain inertia to movements like cancel culture because of all of the stuff that we started this conversation talking about, that it's like we've had this thing slowly building, but now it does feel like it hit the tipping point and now it's just spread everywhere? Do you think there's like a functional reason for that?
Yeah, I think that there have been decades of an attempt to rethink what rights actually mean. So one of the things that the left has done is in the same way that we started off by talking about the redefinition of racism, they've redefined nearly every term that we've talked about here. They've redefined every element of American philosophy to mean almost the precise reverse of what it originally was meant to mean. They've redefined virtually all of American history, which is what the 1619 Project is about. And they've redefined our culture of rights so that rights are, in fact, ways to oppress people. Right? This is when we talked a little bit earlier about the right to free speech being seen as a way for the powerful to silence the powerless. And you see people actually saying this kind of stuff. No, it's crazy.
This is, in effect, what white fragility is about. This is, in effect, what all of the whole BLM platform, this is what it is about. Like, you're not just making this stuff up.
No, and when I wrote the book, I didn't realize that it was going to break into the open this way. I really thought that, honestly, when COVID hit in March, I thought, okay, I wrote this book to rush out before the election, and now it's going to be irrelevant because it's all going to be COVID all the time. And then all this stuff just broke loose in the last couple of months, and I thought, wow, I'm not a prophet, but if I were. Yeah. That's really how it feels. Looking back through the book and realizing that all the arguments that I was making against this particular vision of America, which I call Disintegrationist, and the reason I call it Disintegrationist is because I think that it really stands for the coming apart of America. I think that there's a group of people who say, here are all the things we have in common. And as Lincoln said, we have to be brothers, because if we're not brothers, we're going to be enemies, right? That's just how this is going to be. The better angels of our nature had better win, and we better all be on the same page, or we're going to fall apart. I think there's a group of people who believe that they are the sole expositors of ultimate truth, and as the sole expositors of ultimate truth, they get to club everybody else into submission, and therefore all of the checks and balances should go away because they are now the godlike leaders who know all the wisdom of the ages. They're the best people who have ever lived. This is the impression you get.
It's incredible that
it's unbelievable.
They are better than everyone that came before
what lucky people we are to be living in this time with such unbelievably special people, right? Who get to rip down statues of Ulysses S. Grant and who get to suggest that Abraham Lincoln was a bad man, whereas they would, if they had been living in 1863, they wouldn't have just been abolitionists. They would have been people who are arguing for all end to segregation and complete mixing of people of different races. Like all the principles they hold today that are good principles, right? Yeah. All those principles, they would have held them doubtless in 1863 with no background in any of this stuff. If they had been born, all of their values are sort of floating miasmatically in the atmosphere, and they internalized them, and they would have been, it wouldn't matter. You could have plopped them down in Rome in 100 BC, and they would have held exactly the same values. They exist outside of time. They exist outside of history. They exist absent any other outside influences. They're just the most incredible people who have ever lived in the history of humanity. Good for them. And good for us that we get to live at a time of such saints.
It's so interesting because I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, if you think about how fast it seems the world is moving right now, like, just think about today versus just what we were talking about, say, 10 years ago in 2010, whatever the hell it was. Now, if you take that further back and you plop that person down in 1863, and try to imagine how different the world is. Like, people don't really just sit in that for a minute and realize how different it was without plumbing and electricity and all of those things. And yet somehow their entire moral code would have been which they make up.
It would be exactly the same. It would be exactly the same.
It's quite.
They're not standing on the shoulders of giants. They didn't learn anything from Lincoln. American history has nothing to do with their positions.
Yeah.
They exist as free-floating moral actors in the universe without any background whatsoever. They came to all of the exact right conclusions about life simply through a priori thinking. It's truly an unbelievable achievement of the human mind. I think again we should all feel very lucky to be in their presence. Look, of course this is all bullshit. I mean, the fact is Robert George, who's the professor of moral philosophy over at Princeton, he says he uses this as a sort of thought experiment. He says, okay, so he'll ask his class, you're living in 1860 in Alabama. Are you an abolitionist or are you pro-slavery? And everybody in the room, everyone says I'm an abolitionist. And then he's like, really? Really are you? Because I'd love for you to name these extremely unpopular position you're taking at the risk to your life, reputation, and career right now today. Like that actually risks anything. Because none of you can name any of them, right? You're actually going along to get along with most of your morality. The example that I like to use on this is we're living in an era where everybody thinks of themselves as deeply enlightened and all of this. 100 years from now, all the statues of President Obama will come down. Why? Because he ate meat. 100 years from now, all the statues of President Obama will come down because there's video of him at campaign rallies, in Iowa, at campaign stops, eating a corn dog.
He had that hot dog.
Right, and people are going to say,
I'm with you on this. It's the next frontier of this lunacy.
And what's going to happen is it's going to be, there were people who knew back then that this was being mean to animals, and you ignored that sort of suffering
and
of
worse
the
than
animals.
mean to animals, it's also destroying the environment.
Right, it's destroying the environment. Right, you drove a car. Right? I mean, there were people who weren't driving cars. You can't say that you were completely innocent in all of this. Look, nobody is completely innocent in all of this. The reason that we erect monuments to people is for the good stuff they did, not the bad stuff they did. But again, when you think of yourself as better than any human being who has ever lived, it gives you an awful lot of moral authority to rip down everything around you.
Right. So okay. So we've sort of veered into chapter 2 here, which is when you talk about that disintegration. Do you think that once something starts disintegrating at a certain rate, that then it's inevitable that it will disintegrate? And that's sort of what I think a lot of people are feeling that right now.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, the world really has shifted. The conversation has shifted. It feels like everything's out of control. Can it actually, if the wave has started, can you actually turn the wave around?
I mean, I think the only way to really turn the wave around is to refamiliarize ourselves with principles, which is a difficult task. I mean, we've basically assumed that freedom was in the water for 50 years, 60 years, and it turns out freedom was not in the water. Kool-Aid was in the water, and people have been drinking it at university campuses, and they've been reading Howard Zinn for a while, and now they think they have a very sophisticated view of the world, and so it takes some education in American history and American philosophy to really re-inculcate that. But that's a hard slog. I think it's going to be a rough time here. I don't think this is going to. I think there's this assumption on the part of liberals, like good-hearted liberals, who actually believe a lot of the stuff in the book, because this is not partisan, right? No. I really believe that everything that I've said about American history and American culture, like rights are good, and the Declaration of Independence, all human beings are equal before the law. Like, this should be pretty consensus stuff. I mean, this is not right, left, or center. I know a lot of liberals who agree with this.
Yeah.
But I think that there's this assumption that because everything is Trump polarized, that if Biden is elected, that all this sort of goes back to normal, everybody calms down, it goes away. I think they are really underestimating an ascendant left that sees the wave of history behind them, and they also see a weak actor in Joe Biden. They feel like they can push him around, and I think they're probably right about that.
I mean, the guy's got serious problems. It's like, that's the scandal, right? Like, isn't that the scandal, that no one will talk about the scandal, which is that obviously something's wrong with him?
I mean, it is pretty incredible that that's considered such an out-of-bounds opinion. I mean, the people are like, without any evidence, you're suggesting that he's on the verge of senility. I mean, I watch a tape of him like 8 years ago, and then watch a tape of him today, and Joe Biden was never any great shakes, but he looks like a different dude. I mean, and listen, you can elect him if you want. I mean, that's your prerogative. But recognize that there's a high likelihood you're also electing as vice president.
Right. So, okay, so we started talking about culture, and I wanted to pause you in the middle of it, because when we talk about culture, Ben, someone's going to say, you're talking about American culture, that's chapter 3, but American culture must mean white culture. That's what you really mean, Shapiro, is that it's about white culture.
Right. And this goes back to this whole anti-racist idea, which is that rights themselves are a vestige of a white supremacist system, which ignores all of the progress not only made by black people, but made by black people in the name of rights. In the name of rights. Martin Luther King saying, we ought to have the same freedoms that you all are guaranteed. Our freedom of speech matters no less than your freedom of speech. And Americans saying, because you're making that argument, not the argument the entire system is bad, not the sort of early Malcom X argument that white people are devils and that the entire system is garbage and all of this stuff that he abandoned later in his career. Because you're making the actual American argument, we'll give that a hearing. That makes sense to us, right? I mean, this is the argument, again, being made by Frederick Douglass. He wasn't saying that July 4th is bad. He's saying we're not included in that promise. We should be included in that promise. When you invoke the deep principles of America, your movement is likely to see victory, right? This is the same thing that happened with the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement said, listen, you guys are guaranteed freedom of association. You're guaranteed freedom in who you love, right? So it was a rights argument. Now, I may not have agreed with the application with regard to behavior, but the actual rights with regard to marriage, with the actual early argument, which was everybody should basically be left alone, that was a very robust argument and had a lot of power behind it, because most Americans went, yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I have that kind of freedom. Why shouldn't that guy have that kind of freedom? Like, why not?
Yeah.
Right, which is a different argument than some of the arguments we're now having, which have moved beyond the rubric of rights into, well, I can demand from you a good or service.
Right.
I can, right, that's a bit of a different thing.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist, all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.